And now we're going to move on to Dr. Ken Wagner, the next presentation. Again, it needs no introduction here, especially at Northeast APMS. Dr. Ken Wagner has 40 years of experience working on a variety of water resource assessment and management projects, focusing mainly on lakes. In 2010, he started Water Resource Services, a small company with a focus on water supply protection and lake management consulting. Personally, I always look forward to the golden nuggets of wisdom that Dr. Wagner shares during his presentations. So take it away.
Okay, are you able to see the slide okay?
Your slides are on and you sound great. Just make sure you get in presentation mode.
We good?
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, good morning. I'm about an hour from where we actually would have been meeting. So hopefully, it would have been nice to be there in person, but hey, that's the way it goes sometimes. I have to get out of, I'm not seeing my own slides, I'm seeing me. Let's see. Hopefully this doesn't kill me. All right, everybody hear me okay still?
Yes, and your slides are
okay,
advanced.
Good. No, I just had to get, I had my own picture plastered across my slides here. Not what we really wanted. Okay, and now it doesn't want to move either. Interesting. Okay, there we go. All right, back to start. What I was asked to talk about was the control of internal phosphorus loading, which involves understanding a little bit about what the internal loading is. I suspect that most people on this call do, but I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but I also don't want to blow right by anybody that needs a little more background. So let's cover what I think always has to start with in lake management is the watershed management. I sometimes get a bad rap for somehow not being viewed as favoring watershed management. It's not true at all. Just like West, we wind up dealing with problems in the lake, and you got to figure out how you do it. External loading from the watershed is how most of the internal load in lakes got started. But if enough phosphorus enters the lake, that internal load becomes the dominant source, and the watershed matters less after that. It's not that it doesn't matter, it's just if the internal load is more than half of the total coming in, frankly, if it's even more than a quarter, it's going to be the dominant summer source, and dealing with the watershed won't get you where you want to be. You may still need to deal with the watershed, and watershed practices protect lakes, but they may not be sufficient by themselves. In fact, they're rarely sufficient to rehabilitate a lake. And the easiest way to visualize that is the picture on the lower left. We don't have any best management practices that can make that land on the right side of it behave as though it's land on the left side. It just doesn't work. You know, when you have more than about 30% of your watershed developed as urban or agriculture, there are going to be water quality problems. There's virtually nothing we can do, even if money was unlimited, that is going to keep some of those nutrients from getting to the lakes. Maybe there'll be new things figured out. I'm happy to see that Wes and other people are working on that, but the reality is it is not in the realm of possibility right now. So when we get very developed or very urbanized, very agriculturally dominant, we're going to have problems in the lake. And once those nutrients get into the lake, they can be recycled. The analogy I use is the picture on the right, you know, the leaky boat. Yeah, if you've got leaks in your boat, you need to patch them. But if the boat is still full of water, it's not any more useful. You've got to find a way to get the water out. Well, that's dealing with the phosphorus in the lake. All right, there are multiple mechanisms of phosphorus release from the sediment. I'm listing them all here. Certainly resuspension is part of it, release from aquatic plants, particularly during senescence, some invertebrate processing. Those occur, but those tend to be minor or special cases. The release by mineralization, actual decay, is certainly a big deal. That's mostly under oxic conditions. But if you've got a well-functioning system, things like iron will bind up that released phosphorus and drop it out and keep it out under oxygenated conditions. The problem comes in is when we lose our oxygen. We have redox reactions, reactions where compounds are seeking electron acceptors, oxygen being a primary one, and when they run out, they're looking for something else, so they wind up basically creating chemical reactions that dissociate a number of things in the sediment or in the water column, iron phosphorus compounds being one of them. So we wind up with both iron and phosphorus being put back into the overlying water column. Okay, where the rubber reached the road is how algae managed to take advantage of this. And there are multiple strategies that they employ. I mean, a lot of you on this call are applicators or work with rooted plants. Somebody calls you and says, I have a rooted plant problem. What's your first question? What's the plant? Well, maybe where is it and can you afford it? But it's, if you've got a plant problem, you need to know what the plant is. Well, it's the same with algae. Just saying I have an algae problem or high chlorophyll or low clarity isn't good enough. You need to understand what they are to know how they got that way. Growth in the surface water where there's just enough nutrients, some sort of algal propagule gets there and it grows into a bloom is certainly possible. But that's actually not the common case. What usually happens is we either get growth starting at the bottom and then coming up into the water column, or growth near the thermocline. And the different algae do different things. If you've got growth at the benthic interface in shallow water, you most often get green algal mats like I'm showing in the upper right there. It can include the very far upper right little blue-green mats that will pop up as well, but usually there's adequate nitrogen available in those shallow systems. That's where most of the groundwater comes in. A lot of the runoff comes in and the nitrogen tends to be fairly available. We wind up with green algae problems there. If you take this out into deeper water, the benthic interface in water deep enough to have possibly anoxic sediment releasing phosphorus, but shallow enough that some light gets there. That's typically up to maybe twice the thermocline depth. So it's a fair depth. I mean, a lot of lakes that's 20 or 30 feet, maybe not so much in some other ones, but there's a pretty good zone down there. What we think of as not being very well lit, but it's enough for many of the blue-greens to get by. And that row across the bottom, the Gliotrichia, Dolichospermum, which we used to call Anabena, Aphanizomenon, Microcystis, Warnechinia, which we used to call Coelosphaerium, those all tend to start right at the sediment water interface, just enough light to get by, but phosphorus leaking out of the sediment. They suck that phosphorus up, and when they get it, it's like us packing a picnic lunch and saying, hey, let's go up on the hill and enjoy the light and see it. They'll create gas vacuoles in their cells. Those gas bubbles let them float up, and you wind up with a surface bloom. That's why a lot of those blooms seem to occur overnight, and they can occur in lakes where the phosphorus concentration in the surface water isn't really all that high. Now, the other offshoot is growth near the thermocline. Again, this can be literally several meters under the thermocline, but usually close to it. And that's often where we get our golden algae problems, Chrysospirella, Cyanura, a few other ones. And it's also where Planktothrix, which was renamed from Oscillatura, split off from it because it has those gas vacuoles, those aerotopes, as they call them. That's what you see in that picture. It's got a purplish to pinkish view with a lot of what looks like structures, nothing more than air pockets. And that tends to hang out right in that area. And they may be mixed into the upper lying water. They may decide they don't have enough light because of the storm and increased turbidity, but they'll pop up. And Planktothrix is one of the more common toxic forms of cyanobacteria. So again, where the algae are growing, what their ecological strategy is, makes a difference in how they utilize those internal phosphorus reserves. All right, just to hammer this home, if you think of it in terms of a typical oxygen profile in a lake, in June, we've got this sort of thing where only a little bit at the very bottom has low oxygen. By July 1st, we've got a bigger chunk of the bottom of the lake there that's low oxygen. And by August, it's moved up so that maybe approaching the thermocline. And we've got a big anoxic hypolimnia, big area. Well, what that translates over into the graph on the bottom is when it's early June, you've got a pretty tiny area of phosphorus leaking out from the sediment. It's a smaller volume and it's a long distance up to where there's light. So it's a gauntlet of oxygen. Iron-bound phosphorus will recombine in oxygen and drop out. It's ferrous iron going back to ferric iron, which caused people with tongue-in-cheek to call it the Ferris wheel. It goes around and around. So if you've got a decent gauntlet of oxygen between wherever it's being released and where there's enough light, you won't really have a problem with this internal load. But as the summer proceeds, the area gets bigger and bigger yet, and the distance up to light becomes less and less, so that in August, you're probably at the point where things can grow. You could get growth at the thermocline, you could get growth along here on the sides, and that's where those blue-green algae problems tend to come. Now, if you also have high phosphorus in the surface water, well, yeah, it's gonna get up there, and they realize they packed a picnic lunch, but hey, the food's free at the buffet here, we'll just stay up here and bloom. But that's what goes on. So knowing which algae they are and where they came from matters. All right, so we'll jump over to the actual control options. There's really only a handful. Wes is working one that actually isn't thoroughly covered here, although in a tangential way it is. The first few are really special cases. These are not things that we're going to do routinely. Taking out rough fish so they're not regenerating a lot of phosphorus and stirring up the bottom, that certainly reduces turbidity. But a lot of that phosphorus that comes up with that stays attached to particles, isn't readily available, and settles back out. It's also hard to get rid of all those fish if you don't actually poison the population. A couple fishing derbies isn't going to do it. And it's hard to get lasting results. So this is kind of a special case. Bacterial additives, you can go a long time with that. We've got people on this call, I'm sure, that work with these, and I have seen success cases. But the basic idea that you can somehow take that phosphorus in the superficial sediments out of the picture by decaying that sediment doesn't really make complete sense, because where's that phosphorus going to go? Either back up in the water column or into the bacteria or whatever other compounds are being added, and it's not at all clear that it's inactivated. So there's some tough stuff there. I have seen some of these products work, but I don't know that we thoroughly understand why, because most of them have proprietary ingredients. We don't get to find out all the details. So again, this is one where I don't want to say don't bother. It's a valid technique. It belongs in the toolbox, but it's not clear to me that that's going to be a standard approach for internal phosphorus load control. Likewise, adding better quality water or just more water of any quality to flush the lake doesn't really get rid of the internal phosphorus reserves. Well, it will, it flushes them downstream. It doesn't get rid of, it doesn't control the phosphorus release, but it can mitigate the impact of it. The catch is you need a lot of water. The one in the middle there's a Moses Lake in Washington. Gene Welch, famous limnologist, has done a lot of stuff there, and he thinks it's the dilution that's actually more important than the flushing, because you really need to turn it over every 3 weeks, and they don't always do that. The catch is about the only source of water we have a lot in our urban lakes would be to open up the fire hydrants, and because of the Safe Drinking Water Act having an anti-corrosion rule, a lot of drinking water suppliers load up that water with phosphates so that it coats the pipes and doesn't cause any leaching of metals. Well, we have potentially eutrophic drinking water. We might not be diluting anything if we put that in our lakes. And then we have selective withdrawal. You can put a pipe out into deeper water, and if there's enough water coming in to balance what you take out, you can discharge that water. And there's a lot of philosophical and permitting issues here, because you may be sending poor quality water downstream. But if it's a small run-of-the-river impoundment and the water blows through there pretty quickly, even if it's unstratified, you can pull out that deeper water that may be of poorer quality under a static situation. And because it's dynamic and you keep it moving, you can get it out of there faster than it can go bad. And you can actually minimize impacts to the lake without sending a lot of poor quality water downstream. But again, it's a special case. A lot of our lakes in the summer, we just don't have the volume of water going through there that allows you to do this without you taking out poor quality water and sending it downstream, which may require treatment by permit or may be disastrous for the downstream resources. So again, not a bad idea, just not one that's going to be routinely useful in phosphorus control. All right, so the meat and potatoes of the control is really dredging, inactivation, and oxidation. You can remove the nutrients and a lot of other things if you take out the sediment. I mean, dredging is true lake restoration in that you set the lake back in time. You get rid of the offending sediment, you get rid of a lot of algal spores and macrophyte seeds and root systems. You'll get down to hopefully a more coarse substrate that interacts more favorably with the overlying water. I can't say enough on behalf of the benefits that dredging can supply, but as some people have characterized it, it's kind of like burning down the house to get rid of the termites. It's pretty disruptive. You're really totally re-engineering the system. It's expensive and it's very hard to permit in many places. And of course, it has no effect on the watershed inputs, and you could wind up back where you were if you don't have reasonable control of the watershed. So while I think that dredging has tremendous potential for internal phosphorus control, the expense and the regulatory issues tend to make it not our first line defense. Okay, phosphorus inactivation is basically anti-fertilizer treatment. This is where West's recent talk sort of fits in, and I'll come to an inlet control example. Iron's the most common natural binder, but it doesn't hold the phosphorus under low oxygen conditions. Calcium is used in some high pH systems out in the Berkshires of Mass and in Litchfield Hills of Connecticut. We've got a limestone belt, so this could work out there, but you can have a pH of over 8 before you can consider this working. Otherwise, the calcium goes back into solution. It will hold the phosphorus under low oxygen. It won't hold it under low pH. Aluminum is the most commonly applied binder simply because it's the second most abundant metal in the crust of the earth after iron. And in any given lake, it might actually be more abundant. Really nice work in Maine has shown that if you have 3 times the amount of aluminum in your sediment as you do iron, you're not likely to have internal recycling problems. And almost all the lakes I look at where we're looking at doing this, I find way more iron than aluminum. So it's true, the iron is the dominant form. It lets go of the phosphorus under low oxygen. And if you don't have the aluminum to bind it up and hold it under low oxygen, you can add it. And that's what that does. Lanthanum's been more recently applied. It's incorporated into a clay matrix in the product Phoslock. It doesn't act as a coagulant like aluminum does. It won't pull out particles from the water and clear the lake as a secondary benefit. However, it's more specific for phosphorus. You need less lanthanum per unit of phosphorus you're trying to remove, and you can sort of get it sitting down there and reacting to phosphorus being released from the sediment on an ongoing basis, probably better than you can make aluminum do that. So it has the real benefit. I also like the fact that you had a clay matrix that might at least coat the surface of the organic matter and reduce the oxygen demand, but I realize it takes quite a bit to get to that stage. Bottom line is these can be used for water column or sediment phosphorus inactivation, often with additional water quality benefits like increased oxygen and reduced turbidity. The factors in planning one of these treatments, you understand the existing phosphorus load, internal versus external. If your internal load is 1/4 of the total, there's a good chance it'll make a difference. If it's half the total, you have to deal with it. Doesn't mean you can ignore the watershed, but if you fail to address the internal load and it's half of the total, you have no prayer of getting where you want to be because it's dominant in the summertime when we're worried about the algal blooms. The sources of phosphorus, the activation needs, there's a lot of field lab tests to be done. The types of available sediment phosphorus matter. It isn't just iron-bound phosphorus. There's also biogenic forms, which is the easily released or mineralized forms in certain organic matter. You have to understand the system, bathymetry and hydrology, the flows, the shape of things. If it's too steep a side, the flocks will literally slide down the side. Potential water chemistry alteration with aluminum, we worry a lot about pH, some of the others less so, metals levels and what it'll do with the oxygen concentration. Potentially sensitive receptors. I've not seen a problem with fish when it's done right, but if you get outside of the realm of 6 to 8 with aluminum, you could be toxic. Lanthanum's considerably more forgiving. Some of these other things like, Wes's Biosorb may not have any toxic properties, and that gives a real benefit. An alum flock will also take out zooplankton. So if you do it in a big area, you may have to rejuvenate your zooplankton population. You will smother macroinvertebrates when it lands on top of it. But again, the target is usually areas where the sediment is anoxic. It's not going to be a whole lot of invertebrates you're worried about down there. Accumulated residues have not typically been a problem. It's not like you suddenly get a couple foot of stuff on the bottom. It's usually a couple inches and it disappears and grades into the sediment within a couple months. So these are things you have to think about, though. A few examples. This is the first one I ever got involved with back in 1995. They had horrible algal blooms, cyanobacteria, $7 million beach they'd created on a lake that had been impacted by a duck farm for 30 years. The duck farm was gone, so the smoking gun was found and removed. And when they did the treatment, they got much better clarity. But of course, they're only inactivating the upper 10 centimeters, 4 inches or so. There's phosphorus below that can leak upward. So around 2018, it started going downhill again. It stayed bad in 2019. I'm sorry, it was 2013 and 2014. 2015, they redid the treatment, and we've been good ever since. And with advances in understanding the way to treat and the doses we need, I think the work is actually even better this time. That work was all done by Solitude. Now, it's a different lake, but same idea. They had problems with algal blooms beforehand, particularly blue-greens. You can see 12 years since this lake was treated. They don't have that problem. They've still got a mix of algal types. Occasionally there's some blue greens. Occasionally they jump up over that 3,000 microgram level, which is where I start paying attention. Your algae might be an issue. Anything under 1,000 is minimal. But you can see they're in really good shape with a nice mix of algae ever since that treatment was done. If you knock the sediment phosphorus out of the picture in many of these lakes with minimal watersheds or minimal through flow, you can make a tremendous difference for many years. A study looking at 114 aluminum treatments concluded that in stratified lakes, you get about 21 years of benefit. Now, it doesn't have to be just for sediment. This gets into more sort of the stuff that Wes was talking about. We've got problem watersheds. And if we've got a lot of urban or agricultural area, there's real limits on the level of BMPs we can apply and stop that phosphorus from getting off the land. So you have to do something to keep it out of the lake or to inactivate it when it gets in the lake. Now, this particular case, which is a small lake in Connecticut, not far from Hartford, they had tremendous bursts of summer phosphorus. And I will say that a lot of this wasn't iron bound. A lot of it was that biogenic. And I rarely see that, but this is a real live case. I mean, they're up here at 300 micrograms per liter of phosphorus. And it's all coming out of the sediment. You can see it increasing dramatically each spring into the summer. Well, we started doing low dose aluminum treatments, timing them up right. There's some other factors involved, but by doing this over once or twice a summer over a period of years, we've knocked that phosphorus level down, even with oncoming or continued poor levels of loading from the watershed. This is a mess of a watershed, and there's some real serious need for watershed management here, but it didn't happen in fast. It doesn't happen fast in many areas. And you can see we did very, very well. Of course, we'd like to be down at that purplish line, and we're not there yet. But they have not had any cyanobacteria blooms since they started doing this. It was really bad through here. Of course, the problem then is now we have clear water in a shallow lake. It's only like 7 foot deep. So now I've got a lot of rooted plants. You got to play aquatic whack-a-mole, but that's a different story. Boys, it buys you the time to do the necessary watershed work. And you can take this on a tributary level, and this now is exactly the sort of thing Wes was talking about. I happen to be using aluminum here and pumping it in, but I just did some fast math while Wes was talking. I don't know the cost of the Utrizorb, but in terms of the mass he has to use, it's actually less than the amount of polyaluminum chloride that I'm putting out in terms of pounds. So there's some real benefit there. But here, in this case, we had a lake that had a lot of problems with a variety of algae prior to it. We started inactivating, we're doing better. We refined the inactivation, changed the chemical, made it automatic, made it an automated system where the chemical is automatically triggered to go out through these pumps when it rains. And we did really well for a number of years. Here you get an interesting pattern. In 2019, we started experimenting. How much less aluminum could we use? So let's try even a little less in 2020. And you can see that, yeah, okay, the results declined a bit. 2021 has nothing to do with the amount of aluminum we were trying to use. We treat between Memorial Day and about 4th of July. We finished on July 6th. If you lived up this way this summer, you know, it rained all of July and quite a bit in August, September. July was 3 times normal precipitation. August and September, twice normal. We were just totally overwhelmed. No amount of treatment was going to matter, in this case, in an urban watershed. The good news is in a small lake with a big watershed, the flushing was so high, back to the flushing technique, that we never got a really bad situation with the algae. It wasn't as good as when we had lower flows and we were treating, but we can get away with it. So again, each lake is unique. You have to think those things through. All right, the last one to cover is actually oxygenation and circulation, which are really 2 different techniques. They overlap. When you circulate, you're oxygenating, but when you oxygenate, you don't necessarily have to circulate. But there's a lot of ways to do it, and I think a lot of people on this, presentation know a lot about this stuff. Basically, you get certain benefits from oxygenation, you get certain additional benefits from circulation, but that doesn't mean circulation is a better approach. It depends on the case. When you mix water, you run the risk of making whatever's out there more available. So that is an issue. But when you oxygenate, you can hold that phosphorus in the bottom sediment that's bound to iron because it won't come out. Of course, if you're adding the oxygen, then you have to worry about the biogenic part because maybe your oxygen will increase. Looking at ways to do non-destratifying oxygenation. You're oxygenating the bottom layer. It doesn't even have to be stratified. You can run this across the bottom of the non-destratified lake, but usually you're trying to do that. There's a bunch of ways to do it, and the choice depends on the circumstances. If you wanted to just diffuse oxygen out of it, this upper left-hand one, that works, but you need about 20 vertical foot of runtime so that you don't destratify the lake. A lot of our lakes don't have a hypolimnion that's 20 foot deep. You can put it into chambers this way or this way, both of which work. They are effective. They're not terribly efficient. Or you could pull the water out of the lake, oxygenate it, and put it back. And this seems to be the wave of the future for shallower lakes. Nanobubbles are an offshoot of this. I've tried it once. It didn't work out particularly well. I wouldn't throw it away. It just needs to get a little more work to be ready for prime time. These side stream supersaturation systems, or some people call it oxygen saturation technology, epitomized by some of the stuff Paul Ganser's doing, can work very well. Of course, the system has to work. If it shuts down and you lose your oxygen, things go bad fast, and you can't recover just by putting the oxygen back. Key factors, you've got to put enough oxygen in to counter the demand, which means you need to know what the demand is and realize that it's going to increase when you add the oxygen. Twice as much typically with pure oxygen, 5 times as much with air. You've got to maintain oxygen levels suitable for the target fauna, if in fact that's your goal, or have enough phosphorus binder present to actually inactivate the phosphorus. There were papers way back showing that just putting oxygen isn't good enough unless you also have enough binder present. We just assume it'll be there, but that's not always true. So there's some measurements to be made. And of course, you're trying to avoid breaking stratification in this case. For destratifying oxidation circulation, there's really 3 primary ways. You can use diffused air, and it's flexible, it's tried and proven. There's a lot of ways you can go about it, but that's a pretty solid technique. You can take water from the top and pump it down to the bottom. It's a downdraft system. Resmix makes them. They're out of Australia. Not many in the US. Works fairly well, but again, they like to push it down 30 feet. A lot of our lakes don't have 30 feet. And you sure don't want it stirring up the bottom when it gets there. The updraft system is most epitomized by the Solar Bee, although there are other versions. They make a lot of claims about the long distance circulation. The stuff travels laterally out before it sinks. That only works if everything's at a uniform temperature. Usually you're pulling up slightly colder water, it's going to drop back down pretty quickly. So you get a donut of effect around these things that's not as big as often advertised. And fountains are just a different version of an updraft way to do it. Again, these can oxygenate, they can minimize phosphorus availability, but whatever phosphorus is available, they're going to make it more available by mixing it into the upper water column. So you have to be a little bit wary of that. Key factors, you got to move enough water to prevent the thermal gradients from setting in. That's tough. As water warms up, it takes more energy to move it. General guide of 1.3 cubic feet per minute per acre for an air system, but you could need as much as 2. For pumping, you got to move at least 20% of the target volume per day. Sometimes you need to move it all. So these need to be some pretty powerful systems to be guaranteed to work. Half-gassing it doesn't work, and that's been the big problem with circulation. They don't do it well enough. Delivery of oxygen near the bottom is important while not resuspending the sediment. And if you really want to reduce the amount of algae, you have to push them down into the dark. That's tough to do. You may get different algae and you may lose the cyanobacteria, which may be good enough for some people, but you're still going to have a fair amount of algae in most of these systems. And the mixing, of course, makes whatever phosphorus is available. I've hit that multiple times. All right, so to conclude, the order of effectiveness is dredging, phosphorus inactivation, oxygenation, hypolimnetic withdrawal, and anything else. But the order by cost, hypolimnetic withdrawal, if it's passive, is cheapest. Phosphorus inactivation after that. Hypolimnetic withdrawal if you have to pump it. Oxygenation and dredging, and the other things I can't really assign a cost to because I haven't seen enough success to know what level the application has to be. And that concludes that. I will back up to that slide in case people want to see that more, and I guess we can do questions with what time we have left.
All right, thanks so much, Ken. Let me just double check. I haven't seen any new questions come in. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to add them to the questions box. I have a question, just since I've been reading over your WRF report recently, on oxygenation and circulation.
Yeah.
And just wanted to go back to where you were saying that the concerns of if you're oxygenating and then circulating, that then you would be resuspending that phosphorus, then that would feed the system.
Yeah, it's whatever's there. Again, think in terms of you're completely successful in providing oxygen to the bottom, and you're now suppressing the release of oxygen from iron-bound phosphorus that would have occurred if there was no oxygen there. But you've now added oxygen, so there's going to be more decay, and phosphorus is going to get released from the organic matter. That phosphorus is now going to get carried up into the water column and become available.
If you're destratifying the system.
That's correct. That's why
Okay.
you would probably, it would be preferable if it's a stratified system not to break stratification. You know, not nice to fool Mother Nature type thing. You're better off with that. Yeah, circulation systems tend to be applied more often in shallow lakes, and that's a challenge because the lateral amount of mixing you get is dependent upon the depth over which, say, bubbles rise or you pull the water from. And you need a lot of pulling points or pushing points to make that work well, a lot of diffusers, things like that, and to do it really well. You may get away with it for a good chunk of the year, but when it gets really hot and dry, say in August or whatever, because it'd be any month these days, there are very few systems that can overcome the thermal gradient that can set up very quickly.
Great, and I will just ask one hopefully quick question. How is the amount of internal P loading quantified in a lake?
Oh, that's a good point. Well, you can do it several ways. You can measure the phosphorus in the lake and look at how the bottom accumulates versus the top over the course of the summer. You can measure the periodically in the bottom and see how it accumulates there from before it's stratified until the end of summer when it destratifies. Or you can actually take the sediment and measure the quantity of available phosphorus, quantity of phosphorus in any given fraction. You can do that already bound to aluminum, that bound to calcium, that bound to iron, that bound in organic matter. You can split the organic matter between refractory and biogenic, and that will tell you how much is there to potentially come out. And you can actually do lab experiments to see what comes out if you change the oxygen conditions in it. So there's a bunch of ways to do it. I'm usually very comfortable getting the fractionation of the sediment and then making reasonable assumptions about what percentage of it will come out based on experience elsewhere. But it's nice to corroborate that with actual phosphorus measurements that show the increase. That works in a stratified lake, not so much in a destratified.
Great, thanks so much, Ken.